times. Be with the times.
Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we're gathered here today, and we pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. Can I also congratulate the Consul General on a wonderful term over the last few years. He's been an absolutely exemplary role model for all of us who are involved in the bilateral relationship, and I, as the chair of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, I sincerely thank him for all the support he's given us. He could just as easily sit on this panel here as well. I know he's youth, he claims not to be, but that. I'm very honoured to be gathered by these three very esteemed panel members gathered with me today. I'll let them introduce themselves in a second. But the topic we are talking about today is the role of the diaspora youth in enhancing the bilateral relationship between Australia and India. And to a certain extent, the title is a bit of a misnomer because youth are the diaspora, particularly in Australia. Now we know that South Asia is the fastest growing ethnic, South Asians are the fastest growing ethnic minority in Australia. Hindi and Punjabi are the fastest growing languages. Hinduism and Sikhism are the fastest growing religions. But facts which sometimes are missed are that 3/4 of the Indian diaspora in Australia are in fact aged under 40. And 75% of Hindus are under the age of 40, which out of the 132 major religions in Australia is number 2 in terms of proportion of youth, and 81% of Sikhs in Australia are under the age of 40, which is number 1. And so when we talk about the impact of youth in terms of diaspora, we're talking about the diaspora as a whole. So what these guys have to say over the next half an hour will hopefully be very, very compelling in terms of setting that agenda. But without further ado, I'd like to very briefly introduce them, ask them to make some remarks. We're going to do a brief Q&A, and then I'd love to invite you all to ask any questions that you have as well. So joining me here are Manan Luthra, who is a Premier's Award nominee law student at the University of Sydney. Charishma Kaliyanda, who's an occupational therapist and a counsellor with the Liverpool City, and Rommel Varghese, who's Chief of Staff to Minister Williams, the Multicultural Affairs Minister. Charishma, I might start with you, just to give a brief introduction, and I think you've got a video to share with us as well, and some remarks.
Yes, thank you, Karan. Namaste, everyone, or as we say in the city of my birth, Namaskara. I was born in Bengaluru, and my parents migrated to Australia when I was about 4 years old. So I've experienced sort of both living in India as well as in Sydney. As Karan mentioned, my day job is that I'm an occupational therapist. I currently work for Headspace, which is a youth mental health organisation. But more broadly, I have worked with young people over the last 10 years in various forms. And so that's genuinely my passion in terms of working with young people to build capacity, to build skills, and to kind of see them succeed. As a bit of a side job, my other role is, or the other hat that I wear is, I'm a counsellor on Liverpool City Council. Has talked about the vision from his perspective and the government's perspective. But in order to establish a truly meaningful relationship going forward, I think we need to have an understanding of what the community here looks like as well. So I wanted to introduce the community that I represent to all of you. So thanks, Karan. I'm going to pass it back to you.
Awesome. What a wonderful video. Thank you for that introduction. Manan, maybe you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, so in my birth town of Sydney, we say g'day. And it's very lovely to be here. I've done a bit of TV work in my time, and I think the arts is one of my major passions, and it's lovely to represent the community in that area of Australian society, particularly because India comes from such a rich artistic background, and Australia itself has a very diverse range of art for those who have access to it. And I think marrying those two is something that's really important to me. In addition to my university studies, I see on campus, and I see at the various events that I attend, a lot of international students coming from India. I see a very large diaspora of Indian international students at anything that I attend as a university student. And the main response, I believe, or for lack of a better word, response that I have to the question, or the main topic of today's panel, revolves around the idea of outreach. I think, or I believe, that Indian diaspora have this very strong capacity to bridge the gap between Australians, young Australians, and Australian society with elements of India that they may not be as familiar with or as comfortable with. And I see that this can happen in so many different ways. It can happen in education through simply providing access to talks or public forums like this, where we're discussing issues that relate to India and relate to Australia. Just access to those, discussions is something that could be so easily implemented in terms of outreach. I think the second idea that really strikes me with the Indian diaspora and connecting and making Australia relations something that we can be fully proud of and continue to work on is social media. I think that more and more young people are on social media, and that's something that the older generations have started to pick up on as well, particularly people who run businesses or deal with this community. Not only do we increase their visibility in Australia, but we increase the visibility of the Indian culture itself. We're not limiting the cultural events that we run to specific areas. We're putting it online in a massive pool where anyone can access information.
Wonderful, excellent remarks. Thank you for that. Rommel, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Namaskar, and my native language, Namaskaram. I migrated to Australia when I was 14 with my family, and before that I lived in Oman. So in Oman and Muscat, we were surrounded by a lot of Indians, and particularly lots of Malayalis, in fact. My passion in this space is, with Karan, I worked very closely in the creation of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue many years ago. And my passion came from a very simple conversation with my great-grandfather, who was the first private secretary to the first Chief Minister of Kerala, who said to me, "You've got an opportunity here of being a link between two really great countries. One, a country that is emerging as a responsible middle power in the Asia Pacific, and another, a great democracy that will shine a light across the world, and you've got an important role to play." And that was a conversation I had with him 3 years before he passed away, but it stuck with me when I was a young person, 17-year-old, traveling around India. And for me, that led to working with a group of very outstanding young leaders, including Karan and others, in creating the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. And ever since then, I've been very passionate about the Australia-India relationship through public policy, through government, politics, and other various channels as well. My encouragement to all of you is you all have a voice, and you all bring unique skill sets and ideas to the relationship, which we need to promote. Also want to acknowledge the chairman of my minister's agency, Dr. G.K. Harinath, who's also another outstanding leader as well in the community. And many of you I know in the room who do some outstanding work as well, and we need to highlight those achievements to back home to our friends in India, but also to the wider community here in Australia as well. Thank you.
Awesome, very inspiring remarks, Rommel. Thank you for that. I might stay with you for the first question, and it sort of builds on that. Your grandfather, great-grandfather's very sage words. What do you think the perception of youth in India is of Australia and vice versa? And what do you think we as members of the youth diaspora and those of us gathered in the audience can do to improve those perceptions or better acknowledge those perceptions?
I think, as Karan, as you said, the diaspora has grown exponentially the last 10 years. As a student in the northwest of Sydney, Cherubik Technology High, in 2004, compared to what the school dynamics look now, it has massively changed. If you look at the community, they are becoming more and more affluent, and they're becoming more and more integrated into the system. If I speak to any of my neighbours, they will point out their healthcare professionals, charismas in one such field, but their doctors or their nurses they look up to are Indians, but I can point that in every other profession as well. And that soft touch, that personal link the diaspora builds with other communities in general is, I think, our soft power, we could call it. Where do youth come into it? I think the young generation we're seeing play an important role, being that link between the first generation and the future generations. And we're just seeing that with the number of young Indian leaders coming through. If you look at cricket alone, we've got some outstanding players there, Jason Sangha, Arjun Nair. We've also got some people coming through the public policy space. Varghese is another inspiring leader in this space. So there are a number of other individuals I can name. I think they're silent achievers, we can call them, but they're definitely making an important mark. And I think that's something we need to be very proud of and keep promoting that.
Yeah, fantastic. Charisma, you obviously are a councillor in a city council which has got a very high Indian diaspora in there. What are your thoughts on this question?
Look, I agree with Rommel in that the perception of Indians has changed as the proportion of Indian diaspora has increased in our community. I think it's important to separate out the perception of the Indian diaspora community here and the perception of India as a country, though. I think there's still a little bit of myth associated around, what is India. And I think there's a little bit of a lack of understanding or lack of awareness around, what a young Australian can go and do in India, or what that future interaction might look like for them. The role of the diaspora here in kind of pushing that forward, I think, is extremely important, because of any other group, Indian diaspora are the ones who are invested in furthering a growing relationship between both countries, because, let's face it, these are two facets of our identities. So in order to kind of push that relationship forward, that's a space that we can really work in, I think.
Well, I agree with all the other panellists. There's a certain insularity, I think would be an apt way to describe it, that the Indian community in Australia tend to stick very strongly to the Indian community, and yes, they do tend to be role models and people do look up to them. There's a certain, for lack of a better word, kind of like containment. The Indian community love to consolidate their beliefs and their values, and there are ways in which that can be retained, but can also be expanded to the non-Indian community. I think a really good example of that is Para Masala, or for example, any of the Holi celebrations that are run during the year. Those events are a really great way to reveal or to just demonstrate that the values and the festivals and the celebrations of the Indian community don't need to be limited to just the Indian community. Diasporas can play a really big role in expanding those to people who are not of an Indian background.
The one word that I would sum up, which we've got a lot of leverage, is human capital development. We can talk about the mines, we can talk about defence, and they're all very important sectors. But the one aspect we can really push even ahead of the United States, Canada, the UK at the moment is human capital development. We have an edge when it comes to our universities in Australia in providing the skills and training to a lot of not just Indian students, but Indian professionals wanting to come here and take back to India some of the skill sets and values we can provide through our firms. But more importantly, sending our Australian students to the IITs, to the IIMs, to even other universities in India to get that training at one of the biggest, if not the fastest growing economy in the world. I just don't think, as Charisma and Manan pointed out, that narrative just hasn't seeped enough into our wider community. And that's something we, as a community, I think we really need to talk in one voice, the benefits of that.
I'm conscious that we've got about 5 to 10 minutes left on this panel, so I do want to throw it open to anyone in the audience who has questions.
Do you work with the groups like Young Indians in India? I mean, they've got a huge presence in India. And what kind of delegations we can extend? Because obviously I work in the startup innovation space and we're supporting some of these Indian young startups in India as well as here. But would love to see greater dialogue, real dialogue and exchange happen with Young Indians there. They've got a major network of young entrepreneurs budding. So what are the activities that you guys do? I presume you are more present within the university circle, is it?
So the Youth Dialogue brings together 15 young leaders from both countries once a year for a 4-day dialogue. And the target demographic is actually a little bit older, so it's under 40. And so the average age is about 30 to 32. And these are distinguished leaders in their field. And so we've had 7 dialogues and the kind of alumni, so 25% of the alumni are young CEOs or chairmen of startups or companies there. We've had 3 international cricketers, 2 Walkley Award-winning journalists, about 8 or 9 news anchors. So these are absolutely first-rate influencers in both countries. And the thesis is very simple. We're going to selfishly pick the top talent in Australia, the top talent in India, and for 4 days, once a year, we're going to lock them in a room and get them to become friends. Because we know in the future, relationships are built when people are friends and when they make friendships earlier in their age. And we selfishly want the bilateral relationship to be prosperous. And so, directly to your question, we work very closely with YI, and we've had many chapter presidents, both nationally and Delhi chapter presidents, who've been delegates to the AIYD. And we've actually got quite a great network of YI people who have come to Australia as part of the dialogue. And so there's that appreciation built.
Two things which touch me is that we have a soft touch. And what you said is Indians seem to be very happy to be contained within themselves. One of the things which depresses me the most sometimes is when you switch on the television and there's a big fire happening somewhere or there's some rescue and you hardly ever see an Indian in the fire, as a fire volunteer or a lifesaver, or sometimes I think we are and image is everything and PR is everything, and I think that could solve so many issues straight away about perception. And you get an interview or you get someone with a turban, people, the simple people, forget all the CEOs and the managing directors. The simple guy watching television in Liverpool will say, oh look, it's an Indian guy helping the local fellows. So it's just a point I throw because I feel that our image suffers as a result. Thank you.
Patience, perseverance, and perception, I believe, is the third P. What I would say, sir, is patience is important. It is happening. I with my minister, we went in to the Royal Fire Service just before they started their training. What amazed me is the number of Indians, Sri Lankans, South Asians, and other communities joining our Royal Fire Service. There's a concept of volunteerism emerging amongst young people of other backgrounds, and we have 2.1 million volunteers in New South Wales alone. And out of that 2.1 million, a lot of them are aging, a lot of them are seniors. And if I speak to a lot of the Royal Fire Service commissioners, they're really pointing and really trying to attract hard from those diverse communities, including the Indian community, about getting them involved. And just to give you a good example, at the Paramasala Festival this year, but also at our Diwali festivals run by our fantastic community leaders in the audience, and Holi festivals and other regional festivals like Pongal, we're going to have the Royal Fire Service Brigade participating in the festival, and the ambulance services and the police as well. I'm very proud now when I see someone of Sikh background now in the police force, and it's coming through. It's all about being patient, but it will be there. It'll change. We're a young country. Our migration is still quite young compared to the UK and to the United States and Canada. It will come, but it's about being patient, nurturing our talent, and mentoring them and supporting them along the way. And so being united as a community behind our young leaders as well.
I believe that media and entertainment in Australia is very much attempting these days to reflect Australian society in so many ways. So entertainment is going from a time where migration numbers were lower than what they are now, where the community of Australia was different to what it is now, and the media had to reflect that. However, now that the diaspora and so many migrants are coming to Australia, television and journalism, everything is starting to reflect this idea that Australia really is a multicultural nation, that it's not just, one certain type of individual who lives in Australia. For people who watch TV, it's very important to see something that we can relate to, a reality that we can kind of inhabit, if you will. And now that that's being recognised, there's a really strong push to get actors of colour or to get individuals who who are of different backgrounds to, fill these roles and to take on these responsibilities, because that's what the producers, that's what writers, that's what people are seeing in society these days, and that's the change. I think one of the P's that I want to focus on is perseverance. It will happen. It is happening, because that's just the way that society is changing.
Just to add to that, I think it's important to acknowledge that you can't be what you can't see. And the majority of young diaspora are currently sort of either still first generation or second generation. And it can be an incredibly difficult and frightening experience for parents to kind of encourage their children or their young people to pursue interests that they have no understanding of or they have never sort of come across before. And I'm really grateful that I had incredibly supportive parents who sort of went, okay, give it a try, when I said, Mum, I want to run for council. And that conversation, that encouragement, that support is being replicated in households across Australia amongst other young Indian diaspora. And so that's where the patience will come into it, because in the next few years we will see those Indian Australian faces in the media, in our volunteer services and in other professions where we haven't been before.
Last year there was some discussions under Mr. Matt Keane, the Minister, on innovation, and one of the key points which was discussed, I just recollect that there needs to be, first of all, we have to realize what potential we have. There's a huge potential of the youth power both in India. The average age of the Indian population is 29 in the next year, which is a significant population, and there is a very good potential of innovation and creativity. As Mr. Irfan suggested, that we need to expand, we need to use that the skill or the power that we have. And similarly, we have this panel which is from Australia. So we have excellent people of the Indian origin also in the Australian youngsters. So I think connecting these two to make meaningful, innovative projects is something which we should be considering. And to be very specific, I also suggested that there should be some focused workshops on using some of the creativity and innovation in some of the educational institutions, both from India and Australia.
For me, that's metrics. It's probably not captured in a government spreadsheet or a report, but that's just the human capital element I'm talking about. And we need to translate simple projects like that onto grander scale. And the idea of connecting a primary school in Noida with a primary school in Carlingford is, I think, something we can achieve. It's a project we just need to get a few players on board. But taking principles out of Mala School and other community language schools we've got some excellent results coming out of there. And it is proven now that the students who actually learn a second language actually perform better in academics, as well as they end up getting higher ATAR scores as well. That's why the government, it's a bipartisan thing. Both sides, all sides of politics support it. We want our kids going forward to be very proud of their heritage. We don't want kids to keep their heritage at bay. We want them to be proud of it, but we also want them to play an active role and promote that in the wider community. That's when Australia as a country becomes successful at the global scale as well. And it actually benefits India as well from a trade perspective going forward as well. So it is happening, but again, it's about perseverance and patience. It will happen over a period of time as well.
A space that hasn't really been explored so far, or so much so far, is arts and culture, and the importance of perhaps using that as another bridge to kind of bring the two nations closer together. We have really heavily focused on creating collaborations between educational institutions, both at primary, secondary and tertiary level, but we haven't really looked at how we can create collaborations between artistic institutions or various cultural institutions, or even had a look really properly at how we can build on sports outside of just cricket. I know, given the excitement of the last couple of weeks, cricket's on everyone's mind, but one of the fastest growing sports in both countries is football or soccer. Looking at how we can sort of use some of those shared interests, because ultimately that's one of the strongest bridges to bring people together, which is shared interests, and how you can kind of use that to leverage further growth between the countries. So I think there's still quite a way that we can go, but there are definitely strategies that the Varghese report and others have identified that we can do those things.
On the topic of sport, I mean, Tim Cahill, Australia's greatest ever soccer export, is now playing for Jamshedpur in the Indian Soccer League, which I think is incredible, right? And we just don't talk about it enough. That's a huge win. Where was the Indian Soccer League 5 years ago, right? Nothing. And now Australia's greatest soccer players playing there. There are initiatives in across surf life saving, across repatriating artists from Indigenous art, because both countries have such a strong heritage of Indigenous art. Not to mention developments in nanotechnology, water purification. There's dozens and dozens of shared, collaborative, innovative initiatives happening across both countries. But I think the burden on us is to learn them as members of the diaspora, to understand them, and then to share them amongst our non-Indian friends here, because that helps them understand that actually it's not just rhetoric, there's a lot of action behind the scenes. And I know that both the Consulate here and the various, the Australian High Commission, the consulates there, Austrade, the New South Wales government's, I think Premier Bharatiya in a visit last year committed $1.5 million to taking startups over there. The Victorian government has got a larger budget than most multinationals do in terms of spending on India. So there's a lot of good stuff happening, and I think there's a lot for us to be proud of. We'll wrap up there. Can you join me in thanking our three panelists for a fantastic conversation?
Dream big, achieve big. Gemco Sydney. Any course, any uni. www.gemcoaustralia.com